today, we'll be presenting this with both myself, my name is Mike Harris, I'm lead EMUE trainer and analyst, and also joining me is Kelly Blackman, our EMUE product manager. And so I'll be presenting the material, and Kelly is going to be kind of behind the scenes, manning the chat window and answering your questions if it's a short answer, or if he thinks it's something that will add value to the entire group, you might be saving them and having them come back during the question and answer session. So if you don't feel like blurting out during the QA session, please use the chat function and let us know what your question is. All right, so let's begin. So welcome everyone to this series. This is segment 2 of our EMUE ACE webinar series, and it is focused on improving your scripts through validation and error handling. So this is a topic that came up because we have a lot of people who write great scripts, and they're great scripts until the power goes out, and then they crash and people get them back on track. But we're here to let you know other techniques that you can use to handle those crashes and make your code a little bit more bulletproof, so to speak. So today's focus, we have 3 things that we're really going to touch on. And those things are pre-processing and validating data, handling exceptions, and handling errors. So you've probably heard these things mentioned. And when it comes to error handling and exception handling, a lot of times there's a gray area in between those. So let's start off with some definitions. The first definition is pre-processing and validation. And the way we define that is the gathering and checking of data independent of subsequent operations using that data. So for example, if I get a name from an outside vendor, I might want to check it and change it so that it fits the format that I need to put it wherever it needs to go. The next definition is exception handling. And with exception handling, that's the process of scripting in order to respond to occurrences or anomalous or exceptional events that require special processing, often changing the normal flow of the program execution. So these are things that you expect might come up, for example, a pop-up or an error that might occur on a record in the terminal. But you've seen these happen before, you have them in the back of your mind when you're scripting, and you know that they might occur. And the last thing is error handling. This is the process of anticipation, detection, and resolution of unexpected issues that arise in a script as a result of programming, application, or communication errors. So these are kind of the things you can't really anticipate. So you never know when your network's just going to go down. So if your script can handle that, it's going to be that much more robust and can handle those hiccups and get back on track once you do have network connection again. So let's take a look at pre-processing and validation. So I said that this was the gathering and checking of data independent of subsequent operations using that data. So an example is receiving data from one or multiple sources to enter into a system that are not of the format needed in the destination system. So here we see on the left-hand side of our process, we have John Q, semicolon, Smith Jones. So in our case, if you look at the right-hand side, we need to take out that hyphen and just have our last name, comma, first name and middle initial if it's there. So if you look in the center, that's really where we're going to spend our time focusing today, because we want to get our information from how it comes to us to how we need it. So if we were to step through this process, we'd see that we need to remove the semicolon, remove the hyphen, place the last name first, insert a comma instead of a semicolon, and then place the first name and middle initial at the end. Seems like a lot of work, but it's something that EMUE does really quickly. So to do this, we have multiple commands that are useful in editing different string types. So if you've been to training recently, you probably have a copy of our mainframe or web command reference cards. And if not, those are available on our website to download for free. And some of the commands that are on there include the ones that are up here on the slide. So on the left-hand side, you see what the command is, and on the right is a little description of what it does. So I'm sure all of you have used the copy command, which simply copies data from a source into a variable. I'm sure some of you might not be familiar, though, with the copy field command. And this one is nice because it segments data out by delimiters. So if you have first name, comma, last name, or last name, comma, first name, you can take those and divide it by that comma and say that last name is the first field, the first name is the second field. So field 1, comma, field 2, and you can take just the data you want out of that. And we'll see that here in just a minute. The replace command allows us to replace a character. So in our slide previous, we saw that we needed to replace that hyphen. So this is the command we'll be using for that. Next, we have left and right. And you can see it says get X number of characters from the left side or right side of the string, respectively. These commands allow us to take a certain number of characters and take them off. So for example, if I had a billing period at the end of my variable that was 5 digits long and I knew it was always going to be 5 digits long, I could take that information off using the right. So I could say right and get 5 characters, and that would give me my billing period. Below that, you see pad left and pad right. These are especially useful when you're dealing with terminal applications because terminals tend to be really picky about how they get their data in. So if I have an account number, for example, that needs to be 12 characters long, and my input only has them as 8 characters, I'll need to add some zeros to one side or the other. But I might not know necessarily how many zeros I have to add. So this function allows us to add those characters up to a certain number, so up to that 12, for example. The next one is a great one. The trim, and then we see L trim and R trim. These remove white space. And the L trim and R trim are left and right trims, so they'll trim them from either side. I recommend running this after you pull in any form of data if it's a string, so that you take off any unseen characters. And lastly, we have 2 format commands. We have date format, which I'll have to fix because it says data format. It's actually date format. And it formats a date to use different characters as well as different date order. So you can see an example there at the end. We could take 11/1/2016 and turn it into 2016-11-1. So we can play around with dates. We can also do the same thing with times as well, so we can make it fit exactly what we want in our input. And then lastly, format allows us to format numeric values. And this is useful not only for reporting, but also for systems who are choosy about whether you have commas or whether you have 2 zeros at the end. So for example, the example that's on the right uses the currency form, and it changes it from just a 1000.000 to 1000 with a comma, a $sign, and 2 digits to the right. So here's an example in EMUE. And we're going to see this in just a sec. I'm going to switch over to EMUE itself. So here's our script. I'm just going to start this off, and we're going to talk a little bit once this comes up about preprocessing. Everyone should be able to see my terminal screen here. So once this logs in, we're going to go down. We're going to hit a couple screens first, and then we're going to preprocess our data. So this should look similar to a lot of terminal applications that you've seen in the past. So these first 2 things, initializing variables, we're going to come back to that. But typically you want to initialize any variables at the top of your script that you know you're going to use throughout the rest of your script. And I've copied a current label in here. Now, whether you use this or not is up to you, but sometimes I like to know what the current label is. So if I have to log out some type of error, I can put in the current label variable and it will tell me exactly where I was in my script. So I could say my current label is start of script, and then down here on line 111, you can see my current label is get next record label. So I'm going to step through here, and we'll come back to this wait for screen go to. And now we're into getting our data. So for this, we're going to copy our current label again. And we're going to test that retry record, and we'll talk about that a little bit more after. But here's our preprocessing section. So the first thing I'm going to do is copy in a name, just like we saw in the example there. Let me go over to our variables tab. And just so you can see it better, I'm going to put it here on the right-hand side of my screen. And I'm going to try the whole screen here. There we go. And we'll move that over. So right now I have a patient full name of John Q, semicolon, Smith Jones. If you look at this next command, copy field, I have first name and middle initial is the variable name that I'm going to populate. And you have patient full name, 1, and then a semicolon. So this tells the command that I want the first field, and my delimiter is a semicolon. And if we look over here, the John Q, semicolon, Smith Jones is field 1 is John Q, field 2 is Smith Jones. So when I step through that, I have a new variable, first name and middle initial, and it's John Q. So this is very useful in many fields, not just error handling. Now I want to take the same thing, I'm going to use the patient full name, and I'm going to grab that last name by doing the second field with a semicolon. And you can see that it comes in as Smith Jones. Notice though when I pulled in the data that I have a little space here right in front of the variable. It's not abutted to the left-hand side like everything else. So I'm going to use that trim command in order to get rid of that. And now you can see that it butts up to the left-hand side. The next step in that process that we outlined is that I want to get rid of that hyphen if there is a hyphen. And so when I run this command, you'll notice that Smith Jones becomes just Smith Jones, one word. Now the nice thing about the replace command is if I come here and run this command again, it's not going to fail just because it didn't find that dash. It's going to look through the entire string, and it's going to say, if there are dashes, I'm going to replace them with nothing, because I have double quote, which is an empty string. And if I don't find anything, I just want to move on to the next code line. Now we come to this next line, and I'm going to step off of that for just a second so you could see the difference here. For those of you who were trained several years ago, this might look a little bit different because this is a new feature that we implemented probably 3-4 months ago called replacement variables. So instead of using a concatenate command where I say concatenate my last name, comma, first name, etc. into a variable and then using that variable, I can use replacement variables in order to get that data in a format that looks exactly like the string that it's going to come out as. So when I say last name in braces, comma, first name and middle initial in braces, what that's going to do is it's going to replace those variable names with the actual values that are in there. So I'm going to make that my current script line, and I'm going to run it. And now you can see patient full name, Smith Jones, comma, John Q. So I've replaced that back into the patient full name, and now I can use that for the correct format for my process. So these next few values, all I've done is I've created them for the example. So these aren't things that you'd leave in your script. You would get this from an input file. Notice though on line 136 I have a mount build, and it's that same format that we saw on the slide. And I'm using the format command here with a mount build, and I have C. If I pull up the help on this, you can see that format has a few robust options. So I can format as a general number, currency, fixed number, standard, or even percentages. So in this case, I chose C, which formats a number with a comma separated by thousands, displays 2 digits to the right of the decimal point. And because it's currency, it should also add in the dollar sign, which it does. If I didn't want that dollar sign there, I could also do float, which would do the same thing, but no dollar sign. So now I'm going to come down here. I'm going to go back to my terminal screen, and I'm going to paste my records in. And you can see that I generated an error. And before I do anything with this error, let's go back to our PowerPoint and take a look at how to handle this. So there are a lot of times with records, and we will do web handling in just a little bit, so bear with me if you're a web customer. So with exception handling, we know that we might receive some type of error, whether it's a pop-up on a website or a record in a terminal that isn't found because it doesn't meet the right criteria. So in this case, the example listed here, a record you're entering to the terminal is not found or does not have the correct information to proceed. Or an example from web may be a pop-up with a processing reminder that appears infrequently when a record is using a credit card as payment. So sometimes I know in our Sorian applications, if you're using a type of payment, it might come up with a reminder that you have to handle. But if you're doing mostly cash and a couple credit card payments, you might not see that record all the time. You might see it 1 in 100 records. So in that case, you know it's there or might be there. So it's an exception, not an error. So an example here, on the left-hand side, a known exception to normal processing. And then on the right is our goal of processing continuing at our next record. So we don't necessarily want our process to crash at that point. We want to be able to skip that record, maybe log out some information saying that it was skipped, and then go back up to the next record and keep going so that it finishes out your process and generates a report for us saying what things haven't been processed. So in the middle is where we're going to focus again. So the steps needed to recover from an exception are to first understand the process steps, handle interrupted processing, and then utilize steps to recover from the error. So it's pretty general, but it works for nearly everything that you'll do as far as an exception. So let's take a look at some of these. On the left-hand side, we have our terminal commands, and on the right-hand side are our web commands. So depending on what system you use typically, these will differ on what your focus is. So on the left-hand side, we have wait for screen go to, or for our MS4 customers, wait for text go to, which does also work for Envision. So the use is in Envision and Signature Systems, wait for a screen name to appear at row 24, column 2, for the wait for screen go to, and it goes to the label defined in the command parameters if it fails. So it will look for the label name, and if it's not there, it will go and do some error handling. Wait for text go to will wait for some specific text to appear at a specific location in the terminal, and if it doesn't find that, then it goes to a label defined in the parameters. For web commands, the first one, and the one you'll probably use most frequently, is wait for web element go to. In this case, what it does is when you load a new screen, it waits for a web element to become active. So for example, if I was logging in and my next screen had a button that I wanted to click, I'd look for that button to become available. And if it didn't become available, I would know that I didn't hit the right web page. So on failure, this command goes to a label defined in the command parameters. Underneath that, we have web element exists and web element allows focus, which seems similar, but there's a very fine line between them that I'll explain in just a sec. So the web element exists is used within an if statement, and it checks to see if an element is present on a web page similar to the wait for web element go to. The difference is that with this web element exists, it returns a true false. So if the web element exists, which is true false, then I'm going to do something, or else I'm going to do something else. If it fails, it will do something predefined. And in this case, you'll go to a section in your if statement. Same thing with web element allows focus. Now the difference between a web element that exists and a web element that allows focus is most visible in buttons on web pages. I'm sure most of you have gone to a web page where you had to type something into a text box before a search button would become active. So you type something and then the text on it turns black instead of gray, and you can click and go on with your process. In this case, the button always exists. So if I was testing to see if I could click that button, web element exists wouldn't really do what I wanted it to because it's always going to be there. The web element allows focus will tell me whether I can click through that command and whether I can actually do anything with that button. So hopefully that differentiates them a little bit. So next, let's talk a little bit about error handling. And the example here is a network experiences an outage while EMUE is processing records. We would love it if networks never went down, but the reality is that sometimes they go down pretty frequently.
Maybe towards the end of the day.
So an example of this, on the left-hand side, unknown situations may prevent EMUE from completing normally. And process restarts or exits with error status, depending on count of errors, is our end goal. So I want to restart my process and keep going without failing the entire process. So again, in the centers where we're going to focus our efforts, the steps need to recover are to enter error handling through a previously designated route, to keep track of the number of errors, to process steps to recover from the error, and then to log vital information that can be used to restart the process if necessary. So we have a few commands here, and before I go through these, I'm going to skip back to our script real quick. And I want to show you an example of some exception handling. So up here at the top of the script, we saw exception handling, and we saw this wait for screen go to. The go back once is the label. 5 is how many seconds we're going to wait. And then this is the label that we're actually waiting for. And that would come up right down here where this E1429 is in the terminal, right around there. Now, in Envision and Signature systems, we know exactly where that label is going to come up. In MS4 systems, it's not always the same, so we would use wait for text go to, since screen might give us the wrong thing. Screen has the built-in coordinates for that. So down here I have the same thing. So I sent my information, and my expectation was that we would flip screens and go on to the next step of the process. What actually happened was I entered a patient that didn't have the information that I wanted, and it gave me the error 1429, no patients were found to match your input. So I would use this wait for screen go to. I would tell it what screen I'm waiting for, that ZPM Fund 10. And if I don't find it, I'm going to go to wrong screen. So it's going to wait for 2 seconds. So I'm going to hit step, and you'll see 1, 2, and then it goes down to wrong screen. So it waited for that screen for a couple seconds, and then it flipped. So now down here, I've written some custom code that I wanted to execute if I couldn't find that screen. And in this case, I'm going to copy the screen error message, which is a good best practice because we want to know why the record failed. And so you can see that it comes up right here. And for those of you using Terminal, I love to use this built-in variable and line 24 text because it just grabs the entire line down here on 24 and puts it into a variable. And once we trim it, we have the whole record. We don't have to guess it the length. We don't have to say copy 1 to 30 or anything like that. It just grabs it all for us. So then I come down here after I've trimmed it, and I look for the message. So if it says that my message is something like something at cursor position, so if I had an error at a cursor position, then I would want to handle it in a special way and say get cursor position and log the line cursor position. So that's going to fail. It's going to say, no, your error message isn't like that. So we come down here and hit my else and go to my error handler. Now my error handler here can be used for multiple things. So right here we have a collection of text, and we're going to pause here and go back to our PowerPoint. But by saying go down to my error handler, I'm saying I don't know what happened. My previous exception handling didn't catch whatever error happened, so something else must have happened instead. So for example, if I ran into a system outage and I could not find that screen with line 145 here, there wouldn't be a screen there to get the information, so my error message here would not say at cursor position. It would say something else. It would basically get nothing. And then it would come down into my error handling and take care of the unknown error. So let's scoot back here to our PowerPoint. And for error handling, there's these 8 commands that you don't need to know all of them, but it's good to be aware of them, and I would say you'd probably use about 80% of these. So the first one here, set startup enable debugger, we want to set that to no. Now the set startup enable debugger, most of you are familiar with because you have it on yes when you're debugging your script, and then right next to it it says set to no for production. And some of us, even myself when I first started, I was like, okay, I'll set it to no, but might not know exactly what it does. So in this case, typically when debugging a script, this would be set to yes. And when we turn it to no, it does three things. The first thing is the debug statements will be ignored. So if you put any debug commands in there, it's going to completely ignore them. Next, any breakpoints that you've put in while you were debugging your script will be ignored. And lastly, error handling is enabled. So if you want error handling to occur, you actually have to tell EMUE that you want it to do things automatically on its own. So setting enable debugger to no does that for us. And you can see the syntax here, simply yes or no. The next command is exit error. Exit error, most everyone has used in their script. And if not, this is a powerful tool that we have. And what it does is it allows EMUE to know that it has not processed successfully. So in this case, you can see that it's run as a default when EMUE encounters an error and the debugger is set to no. This command also is used during other exception and error handling scenarios when script logic is used to determine that the script should no longer continue processing. For example, if I looped through and I tried to open a certain page on my website 5 times, and I've logged a counter every single time, at the end of that 5, I might want to exit error and say, gee, I couldn't open this website, so log it out and exit error, send me that error email. So the last point down here is that exit error will also trigger the error emails to be sent if the set startup error email options were valued in the set startup section. So in your standard template, one of the settings is set startup error email, and those control what the exit error does. The next command here is on error. Now, many of you may have seen on error, but might not have realized what it did. You might have copied it from template to template. But what on error does is it tells EMUE how to perform its job when it encounters an error. So you're telling EMUE, on error, I want you to do something specific. So you can see in that bottom left-hand corner, when EMUE encounters an error, it's placed into what's called an error state. So EMUE sees a flag and says, hey, I'm in an error state, which means that EMUE is aware programmatically that it's encountered an error and has to do something special. The instructions for where to go when the error occurred are entered as parameters to the command, and the instructions last until the next on error command is reached. So if I said on error, go to error handling label, then I said on error, go to main label, then on error, go to something else, the last one it hits is going to be the last one to be valid. So it first would have gone to the error handling label, then it would have gone to the main label, and then it would have gone to the something else. We also have exit error, go to, and resume. So you can say on error, exit error. And that's kind of the default behavior anyway in EMUE, but it's available if you want to see it explicitly written out in your script. Go to will allow you to go to a label, and then resume we'll talk about in just a moment. So we have resume, and it said next there as well. We'll talk about that too. Resume is a way of handling an error state once it's occurred. So we have the ability to clear the error and continue processing in a logical manner. And with the next keyword, we resume right where we left off in our script at the very next command. However, EMUE has cleared the error and it goes back up and processes it. So if we did resume label name, we'd clear the error and start executing code at the next line starting at the label specified. So you can use next or you can use label name. Now, these both have a different philosophy behind how we use them. The next command is very useful if you've handled some error within your error handling label and you just want to go back up and do the very next thing in your program. That is not always the right path for processing patients, but it may be for processing a different process where the website was down, you need to kickstart the website, get back there, and then you can go back to the next step in your process so that you don't repeat steps. Label name can be used as well so that you go back up to a specific label name instead of going to the next step of the process. So that can be useful when you're processing patients. If I said resume, get next patient, it would go back to that label and it would start over getting the next patient on the list. Next, we have on error, end on error. So for those of you who like if blocks, you will love on error, end on error. Because what this does is allows us to create a block of text that tells EMUE exactly what to do in an error state. So in some cases, using the on error block can give you the flexibility to handle errors without creating a whole new label. So if you know you're always going to want to do the same thing over and over no matter what the error is, you can create something simple like this. On error log, there's been an error and computer name, which and computer name is simply a built-in variable that tells the name of the computer that EMUE is running on. That's a very helpful variable if you have a system that has 16 EMUE installations, because you might not know what computer it failed on, or if you're running a lot of VMs, same thing is true. So it gets the computer name and puts it in the error so that you know where it happened. And the syntax is simply on error at the beginning up here, and then end on error once you're done with your block. So a few more. Clear error. This is a command that clears the error state from EMUE. So earlier I said that once EMUE hits an error state, it sees a flag, it knows, hey, I'm in an error state. So we need a way to clear that away before we hit another command. Because the default behavior in EMUE is if I hit an error, I raise my error state. If I hit another error right after that, I exit error. So even if you're handling your error status, if you hit another error within your error status or within your error handling label, you can still exit error unexpectedly if you haven't cleared out the error. So using clear error, we have the ability to just wipe the slate and say, we're good, we've handled our error, clear the error status, and continue through my error handling. Next is reject. And this will be particularly useful for those of you who use text files in order to read input data. This command allows us to quickly log out information from an input file without having to do a log line or create a concatenated string of variables in order to log something out. With reject, once you've hit a read command, you can use the reject command to put that line of input into a file. And so I welcome you to test this out on your own machines when you have a chance. Simply use the read command, and then right below it, use the reject command. And you'll see that once it's read something in, the reject command puts it right out to an output file or an output log. So it can be used multiple times to populate one error file with the same name as the input file. One thing I will note about this, and this is found in the help information as well, when you use reject, this is going to populate an error file within your input directory. So wherever your input file is, you'll see a new folder in there called error. And when you click into it, it will have a file with the name of your input file on it that's just .txt, and it logs it out for you. So it does a lot with this one little command. All right, last but not least on the error handling codes or commands, we've got clear call stack. Clear call stack is used to clear any previous calls that have been made and return EMUE to a state where there's no calls on the stack. For those of you who haven't done programming in other languages, that might seem like something crazy right now. So what that means is when EMUE runs a command, it's basically calling to a function and saying, do this special work and then move to the next line. Well, when EMUE hits an error, it might not remove that call. It might not say, okay, I completed that copy command, move to the next one. It might get stuck on that copy command and say, gee, I didn't complete that. I'm going to go back to that. So if you get to the end and you hit an error, you might have to clear your call stack in order for EMUE to wipe the slate clean and go back to a label and start processing normally. One note about this, though. If you have a return command after you have a clear call stack command, EMUE will throw an error. And that's because the return command uses that call stack to go back to the last processed line. So if I've cleared it out, I've basically taken away that command's GPS and it doesn't know how to go home again. So make sure you don't use clear call stack after a return command, or vice versa. So some specialty commands for error handling. We talked about wait for screen go to and wait for text go to for terminal. We talked for wait for web element go to, and the web element exists, web element allows focus. I'm not going to talk about web element exists and allows focus again because those are useful for both error handling and exception handling. So it's the same process, just different concept. But the other commands up here, wait for screen, wait for text, and wait for web element, you'll notice they don't have the go to at the end of it. That missing go to is going to change the function of this command. Specifically, what's going to happen is when you fail this command, instead of going to a specific label, this is going to go wherever you told it to go with error handling. So if I said on error, go to error handling label, when it hits this wait for screen, if it fails the command, it's going to go to my error handling label because I told it on error, go to someplace. Same thing for wait for text. And I'll remind you again that wait for text is necessary for MS4. We can't use wait for screen. But it does the same exact thing. It waits for some text to appear at a specific location. If it doesn't find it, it goes to a specific label that you've told it to with the on error command. And same thing for wait for web element. So here's an example from EMUE. And we just saw this. We're going to go back in there and check it out again. So we can take a little bit of a look at this. So the first line up here, send S, clear. That clear command for terminals is going to get us all the way back to the beginning of our terminal in most cases. It's going to act like a Control-Alt-Delete and get us out of wherever we are, bring us back to the beginning. The next line here uses some inverse logic. So this inner portion here, and I always tell people to evaluate the parentheses. So wherever there's a parenthesis, what's inside should either evaluate to true or false or be part of the next command next to it. So in this case, gemfun01 24.2 is going to check the screen at that portion with that check S command, and it's going to say, have I found it or haven't I found it? So I've checked the screen for gemfun01. If I found it, it returns true. So by putting that not there, you can read it in English as, if you have not found the screen, then we're going to do something. Otherwise, it's going to come down here. So if I've not found the screen, I'm going to log a line that says unable to recover from script and go to my exit error label. Otherwise, I'm going to continue down here and do some retry logic. So I send a clear, and it comes back here. Now, it says if I'm not at the gemfun01 screen, then I want to log something. So my expectation is that it's going to come down here to the end if. And it does. It found gemfun01 down here at 24.2. And both Envision and MS4 customers can use this. And then I'm going to continue on. Now, earlier in the top of the script, you saw that I used retry record count. So all the way up here, I did retry record as yes or no, and I did retry record count as 0. This logic allows us to go back and retry a specific record. And you're welcome to pull this logic out of here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to increment that counter. And I'm going to say if my retry record count is greater than 3, so if I've retried that record more than 3 times, I want to fail that record and I want to go back and get another record. So if I've done it more than 3 times, I would log this line saying that I failed it. And I would reset my retry record count to 0. I'd set my retry record to no. And then I would do this increment exception count command. For those of you who have gotten onto the dashboard, the increment exception count actually affects one column on the dashboard, which is called exception count. And the exception count is simply a counter that exists in EMUE and reports out to the dashboard. So if I run this command, it's going to affect this variable right here, and exception count. So you see right now it's at 0. When I come up here and run this command, now my exception count has gone up to 1. If I was looking at the dashboard, this would report out in the exception count column. And that would allow me as a monitor of a script to look at the script and say how many records have failed at this point. And you can see this next logic here. If exception count is greater than 5, go to exit error label. Now we put this in the retry logic because if I incremented my exception count out here, every time we retried a record, I would be adding to my incremental counter. And we wouldn't really want that because then we would see 3 exceptions for every record that I've processed or failed and tried to reprocess. So by putting it in here, when I've exceeded that, before I skip to my next record, I increment my exception count. So at this point, I'm saying one of my records has failed. And if I fail 5 records, something's up with my script and I want to fail it. So I'm going to go to my exit error label. So at this point, if I hit this go to get next record label, it would go all the way back up here and it would get my next record. And then it would say, if my retry record is equal to no, then I'm going to come down here and get my next record. Otherwise, it's going to try it. It's going to come down here and copy retry record no. So let's come down here to my error handler. And after my error handler, actually, we're going to log out of our system. Now we're going to talk a little bit about web scripting and the error handling in web scripting. So I'm going to do some initialized variables here. I'm going to copy my retry record and my retry record count, which we talked about. I'm also going to do a global retry count. And you can use this in terminal as well, but I didn't in the example above. And all I typically use the global retry count is for an overall count of how many errors I've had in my script. So if I've gone through and I've retried a record 3 times, that's 3 errors. And I retry another record, that's 6 errors, 9 errors, so on and so forth. So your global retry count is probably going to be pretty high, but this is another way of keeping track of your errors other than the increment exception count. I come down here to log in error count, and then I'm going to get some data. Now you'll see the next command that I hit at the very top of my script before I've gone to a web page at all. I do on error, go to error handling. So I run that command. Doesn't do anything that we can see, but in the background it's set the error handling to go to that error handling label. And I'm going to open a web page. And while that's opening, I'm going to move my screen over here. And I'm going to move that there so we can see it. And let's move that back to our tabs. There we go. Now I copied our username and password in. And this first one is an example of the if web element exists. In this case, what I'm looking for is right here at the log on button. So I want to click the log on button, and that's important. You want to try and identify elements on your web pages that you actually want to interact with. Because just because this on this page any username is valid comes up doesn't mean the login button that I actually want to do something with came up successfully. So I would want to identify the things I want to work with. So in this case, I click Step, and it says if it exists, and at the end here we have 60 seconds, or 60,000 milliseconds. So I would be willing to wait up to a minute for that to appear. Maybe I have a slower website that doesn't respond as well. So I can increment that as much as I want. So if it's there, I want to type my value, and then I want to click my web element. You can see here in the else clause that I can say can't find sign-on page restarting and go to retry logic. So I can handle the fact that my web page doesn't come up properly. So I click login and I go here. Now the check for warning password notification, this is a section where if you have a password that expires on a frequent basis and you may run into a screen that says your password has expired, please change your password, you may want to have the check for password notice. And in this case, we have the wait for web element go to, and it says login error. It's going to wait for 5 seconds, and it's going to search for something on the success page. So in this case, this searching link down here is what I want to identify and work with. So I'm going to wait for that for 5 seconds, and if I don't find it, I'll know that there was a screen in between that came up that EMUE didn't know or didn't notice before. So I'm actually going to change that to a 2, as it shows here in the comments. And I'm going to run that. And you're going to see that it waits for 5 seconds before moving on. And after 5 seconds, it goes down here to my login error. And in this case, it would increment my error count. And it would say, if this web element exists, it's going to wait for 3 seconds in this case. And it's going to be a password expire notification. So it'll test to see, did that password expiration screen come up? 3 seconds. If it didn't, then it'll say, I'm unable to log into the website with username such and such, which will come up on my main tab down here, as you can see. And then if my login count is greater than 2, then what I would do is I would say too many login attempts for user and aborting the script. Now this is important if you have logins with passwords that will kick you out of the system. Because if you try 3, 4, 5 times, it might lock you out. And that's not a really desirable situation. So we set this pretty low at 2 in order for EMUE to fail and you to be aware that there was something weird going on with the password. So in this case, I would go to my retry logic, and this is where I have my retry count. So I'm going to increment my global retry count because it was an error, which is all I care about. It's going to say my global retry count is something, which goes down here in my main window. And it says if my global retry count is greater than 20, so if I've encountered greater than 20 individual errors, then I'm going to go down and say that I exceeded my maximum count and go to my exit error label. But I didn't. So I'm going to come down here, and it's going to say if my record retry or retry record is yes, then I'm going to go back and I'm going to test the logic. But at this point, I haven't looked at a record at all. So then I'm going to close the web page. I'm going to clear my call stack, which is that command we saw earlier, and then we're going to go to open browser and do the same thing. And in this case, it would try the same logic again. Oops. So what I'm going to do now is just step through, and I'm going to put a breakpoint. I'm not going to put a breakpoint because I'm not debugging at the moment. And I'm going to change that back to training searching. There we go. Okay. So once it finds it, we do other tests. And if retry record equals no, then I get a record. Update and retry. And then I can come down here. So after this, after I've said my retry record is no, that means that I want to get a new record. I'm not retrying the previous record. And then this copy retry record yes allows me to set that so that I can retry a record more than once. So in this case, I click the web element, and it comes up with a search screen. put my information in there, my last name, my MRN, and I click some buttons and exit. And then at the very bottom here, this is important to note, once I've successfully processed my record, I want to set that retry record back to no. And so on and so forth, and so it continues. So again, you will have access to this script. So I welcome you to pick it apart and look at how it works. So let's go on, and I'm going to skip quickly through the rest of this. I know we only have a few minutes left, and I would like to leave a little bit for questions. So pre-processing versus exception handling, we talked about that. Pre-processing is done up front before you enter the system, before you do anything else. You process your data, make sure that it looks the way it's supposed to go into the system. Whereas exception handling is when you're branching because you know things are going to pop up that might happen 1 out of 100 times instead of the normal course. With error handling or exception handling versus error handling, same thing, exception handling is something you know of, but error handling is unexpected. It's system outages, it's unexpected data failures, things that you have never seen before, couldn't have anticipated, but you want to anticipate that a failure could occur. Always expect the unexpected. So with this diagram, hopefully this will be of use to everyone when you get this PowerPoint. But this shows where you should do your pre-processing in your process. So you get your input record on the left, and you're going to ask in your script, do I have the appropriate data or do I have missing data? If I have missing data, then I might want to skip the record. And if I have appropriate data, then I'm going to go into the system, and it will come up as found or not found. And if it's not found, then you go over and log and skip the record. If it is found, then you're either going to process it correctly, might find a new pop-up, or the processing failed. And in which case, anything that's in yellow would be some type of exception handling because we could expect it. Whereas red down at the bottom, if data is missing in either our input file or our system itself, so I went into the system and I couldn't find the label I was looking for example, it might mean a system outage, and that would be error handling. So some tips to make your scripts error tolerant. Think about and plan ahead for your current process and outline any areas where pop-ups or error codes can occur. Review your input data to understand how it's structured. Use our web best practices template, which I'll be providing to you on the website as a guide to include generic error handling. When beginning a script, use bad data examples, not just happy path data or what should work, because a lot of times you will get bad data. Debug your code slowly and then debug it at full speed. So make sure you watch it going at full speed because a lot of times errors occur because of wait times or system unavailability. So running it at full speed will let you see those errors. And then lastly, check for this correct screen for both terminal and web, and do that often. And my recommendation is at least every time you flip to a new screen, check to make sure that you made it to that screen correctly, because there could have been a middle screen or there could have been a pop-up. Either way, checking for that screen will help you mitigate that. And to help you remember that, just remember, trust EMUE. So think about the current process, review data before scripting, use the web best practices script template, script with good and bad data, test it slow and full speed, ensure you reach the correct page, make useful log entries when errors are found so that you can see where they failed, use on error to direct error handling, and enjoy an error-tolerant script. So we only have a couple minutes left, so I apologize for taking up almost a full hour, but do we have any questions, Kelly?
We've had a couple questions primarily about the presentation and materials and that sort of thing, but nothing else other than that.
Okay. Just to address that.
I'm sorry, Petra just asked another question about a list of error numbers, and so that is actually something that is listed in the help file under the error handling section inside EMUE. So you'll see a complete list of what the error numbers are and what the messages they correspond to. Sorry about that.
That's good. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you very much, everyone.